Penguins fans, it's time to take a trip into the multiverse. Today, Hunter and I are going to go over some moments in Penguins history and ask the question, what if they went just a little differently?
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am one of your hosts, Hunter Hodes. You can follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. Beside me is my co-host, Patrick Damp. You can follow him on Twitter at Synonym for Wet. You can also follow the show's Twitter at LO_Penguins. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. You can make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Of course, thank you all so much for making this your first listen/watch of the day. So, it's Fun Friday here on the Locked On Penguins podcast. We figured we'd bring you something that we've never really done before. And heck, that's the first time I've not done an intro for the show in 4 years. So, Pat, thank you for doing that. That was really well done. And yeah, we're going to step into the multiverse of madness here for you Marvel fans out there. That was one of the Doctor Strange movies, one of the okay movies in Marvel. Not as good as Infinity War, Endgame, or some of the other movies like Civil War, but still not bad. And the first one we have for our first segment, what if Sidney Crosby doesn't miss all those games with the concussion back in 2010 and 2011, right after David Steckel had that awful hit in the Winter Classic, which changed things forever with Sid? The first thing that jumps to mind for me with that, with where he is right now, points-wise, 15th all-time, 1,502 points, 550 goals, 952 assists. He probably has, 200 more points, is up to 1,700 points in his career right now. That would put him number 9 all time in terms of most points in NHL history. And we wouldn't be talking about if he could reach into the top 5. That would basically be a foregone conclusion, because if you look at that right now, the top 5 is Ron Francis at 1,798. Sid will be easily getting there at that point. I think the question we would be asking, Pat, would he be able to pass Jaromir Jagr at number 2 with 1,921 points? Because you think of all that time he missed with how he was at the height of his powers, he easily, I think, would have another 200 points right now.
I was waiting for you to say the one thing that really always gets brought up about the concussion season. And that's right before the Winter Classic. The guy went on a 25-game point streak where he put up 50 points. In this era, he did that. So, I mean, I also think about that team too that year, because that's also Evgeny Malkin blowing out his knee later in the season. And by the time they get to the playoffs, they go on and play Tampa Bay. They lose in 7. And I mean, what if both of them stay healthy? Because I think about this ripple effect too, right? Do they trade for James Neal if both those guys stay healthy? I don't know if they do, because that team was humming along. It wasn't great. Like, it was when it's when we got our first taste of the demise of Ray Shero, where it was, let's just lean on the top 6, just hope the bottom 6 isn't terrible, and we'll run with those guys. And at the time, it was a good theory of the case, because Crosby and Malkin were both still so young, so you could really just let them run, and play 25, 26 minutes a night. But, man, think about that ripple effect should they not trade for James Neal. That means you're not trading for Patrick Hornqvist in 2015. So, or 2014. So where does this franchise end up? I mean, I think they have at least one more Stanley Cup before 16-17, because that 2011 team was great before the injuries, and then the 2012 team, even the circus of the Flyers series, that was a great team. They were a legitimate contender.
They were deep that year. I honestly think that was the best team in the league that year, and it's just unfortunate that Marc-Andre Fleury couldn't stop a beach ball in that series. That 2010-11 team, you said it, that was a good team, and some people may have forgotten, they went up 3-1 on the Lightning without both Sid and Gino. Jordan Staal was a wizard in that series. James Neal was also really good. And I'll never forget losing game 7 on that stupid Sean Bergenheim play. I blocked it out of my memory at least a little bit, but it still comes back every now and then. The East was so bad that year. You remember it. I mean, that was the year that Boston got, no, that wasn't, was it that? No. Was that Boston? Yeah, I believe that was, it was Boston that got to the final that year.
Here's the thing I will say, though, that this multiverse timeline that we're on right now may have robbed us of one of the best Stanley Cup finals of all time in the 2011 Stanley Cup finals. Boston-Vancouver was, outside of game 7, that was a great series. I mean, it took the circus and violence of the Penguins series the next year, but dialed it back just enough that it wasn't a circus. There was speed and skill, because you think of those Bruins being a big bad team. They could score. Like, they could score, and so could Vancouver. Like, that is, in my lifetime, maybe a top 5 Stanley Cup final of all time.
It was one of the more fun ones I've watched. I mean, that was when Henrik and Daniel Sedin were at the height of their powers too. Roberto Luongo was playing really well, but for the Bruins, obviously, Tim Thomas was on another level. I mean, I don't think I've seen many goalies in my lifetime perform like that throughout a playoff run. He was fantastic. Patrice Bergeron, Brad Marchand. I believe they also had Nathan Horton there as well. Zdeno Chara, of course, so many other players. And a Pittsburgh-Vancouver final would have been a lot of fun just for so many different reasons. Seeing the Sedins go up against Crosby and Malkin, if Malkin, obviously doesn't get hurt. And, seeing Marc-Andre Fleury get back there facing off against Roberto Luongo. The Canucks had some guys that could really take a bite off you. I mean, heck, they had Rafi Torres on there. He scored a game-winning goal in one of the early portions of that series against the Bruins, if I remember correctly. So,
I mean, think about it this way, right? I'm looking at this Stanley Cup playoff. First and foremost, let's say it all shakes out the same bracket-wise, right? But the Penguins have their guys. They probably beat Tampa Bay, and it probably isn't going 7. It's probably going to be 5 or 6.
I agree.
The next round, Tampa goes on to sweep the Caps. I mean, that was not a good Tampa team, and they swept the Capitals. So what does that Penguins team do to Washington? They probably do the same thing, or at least it goes gentleman's sweep in 5. And then a Bruins-Penguins conference final would be tough, because listen to this. I forgot about this. I said the Bruins could score that year. You want to take a crack at what their goal differential was?
Let's see. Just overall, I'm going to guess it's plus
through the whole playoffs.
Plus 10, plus 15, less?
You are not even close. Plus 28.
Wow.
They scored 81 goals and only gave up 53. So I do think that team could have given the Bruins a run for their money, but that was a juggernaut. Funny enough, despite having Roberto Luongo, the Canucks were a -11 that playoff year.
That seems weird, just because of how much talent they had up front and how good the Sedins were. You had Ryan Kessler there, who was awesome too. It seems weird that they were -11, and defensively they were great too. I remember from that run, one of my favorite goals from watching that back is always the Kevin Bieksa goal. It comes off the stanchion. Do you remember that when it came?
That was an overtime series winning goal.
Yes, Can you imagine if that happened to the Penguins in this generation? I don't think it would be just, I don't even want to imagine that.
Twitter would have already imploded on itself.
Yes.
By now. We wouldn't have Twitter anymore, because the Penguins fans coping on it would just destroy the platform.
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. Is there anything else in this what if for Sidney Crosby not getting the concussion? I mean, again, the points, that run in 2010-11, sure, the Flyers series, but he at least was back by then, which was awesome. And then 2012-13, he had just come back as well. But that was the broken jaw. So
that was the lockout.
We can even do a little what if for that, because he wins the Hart and the Art Ross that year easily.
The biggest thing one of the bigger things I would have wanted to have seen, because it's just how he was in that season, that 10-11 season, that Winter Classic at Heinz Field. It was Heinz Field at that time. Don't come at me for that. It was Heinz Field at that time. he had a flair for the dramatic that season, like more than he usually does, because he was coming off the golden goal just months early, just a year earlier. And he would have done something wild in that Winter Classic if he not gotten hurt. He would have like scored in overtime and there's no roof in a stadium, you idiot. It would have been loud, and he would have done something amazing in that. So like it just sucks. So I'm glad it's obviously behind us. He's back. He's healthy. He's solidified himself as one of the greatest. But man, were we robbed of prime Sidney Crosby.
We really were. And again, I'm obviously glad he's a lot healthier now and that he's just still continuing to kick so much butt, because at that time it felt like, was he even going to come back just because of how serious the concussion was? But he did.
During that run, teams had to plan for him to score 2 points.
Yes.
For like a month and a half, teams had to go, well, Sid's getting 2, so how do we get 3?
And you saw the numbers that Connor McDavid put up this year, right? We missed that from Sid because he would have done that and then some in his peak years. So it's unfortunate that happened, but again, glad to see him still kicking a lot of butt now. That wraps up this first segment. Coming up in the second segment, we're going to continue the What If series with what if the Penguins beat the New York Rangers in Game 7 of that 2014 second round series, because a whole swath of different things could have happened. So that's coming up right after this. But before we get to that, football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long, because right now, when you bet on Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every win. You can use them on your spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL and Locked On. All right, we're back here on this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am Hunter Hodes. That is Patrick Damp. So this one is always a fun one to think about, because that second round series against the Rangers, they had beaten the Columbus Blue Jackets in the first round. And it was a much harder series than I thought it was going to be. I remember when they went up 4-0 in Game 6. And I'm like, I'm just going to relax, drink a Pepsi at the time. And then all of a sudden, 4-1, 4-2, 4-3. I'm like, oh, this isn't going to happen, is it? Thankfully, they clamped down the final 6 or 7 minutes. They go on to play the Rangers. They go up 3-1 on the Rangers in that series. And then it all went south. Obviously, I think at least a little part of that, the Rangers really rallied around Marty St. Louis because his mom sadly passed away. I definitely think they really, rallied around him just that whole playoff run, to be honest. But, outside of that, you can also credit the Rangers for everything in that comeback. They really stifled the Penguins in Game 5. Henrik Lundqvist, who I will still say he's the best goalie of this generation, only gave up 3 goals in those final 3 games. Game 6, Marty St. Louis scoring on Mother's Day to honor his mom. I mean, that doesn't get much better than that for the Rangers, at least. And then Game 7 comes home. Penguins are able to tie the game at 1. And then the Rangers score to make it 2-1. And then they're able to hold that lead for over a period, if I recall correctly. And Lundqvist was just under siege, but he was making all those saves. There were a couple instances late in that third period where he was making saves where I was like, how is the puck not going in the back of the net, because the Penguins were trying to tie the game? And had the Penguins won that, Pat, I don't think you see Ray Shero get fired. I don't think you see Dan Bilesma get fired. Does Jim Rutherford even get hired to be the GM at any point? Do they go on to win the Stanley Cups in 2016-17? Because they would have played a Montreal Canadiens team that next round, which was not that good. This really could have sent the franchise into a whole different dimension.
Yeah, I mean, I want to add the caveat here that if we're going to do this what if, right? The big X factor, as much as we want to talk about Dan Bilesma and the roster construction and all of that, it's all very fair. And they blew a 3-1 series lead, Marty St. Louis, all that, right? It's all fair. It's all part of it. It's all part of the stew that makes up that loss. But at the end of the day, it was one of the times that Henrik Lundqvist they couldn't solve him. They could not figure him out. And he just played on an absolutely elite level. On the other side, you had Montreal, who had just beaten Boston. And the same thing happened to Boston. They could not figure out Carey Price. And add in the fact that at the time, that was peak of his powers, PK Subban, who was at the time probably the best defenseman on the planet. So, I mean, that said, you never know, because if they win that series and think, we just vanquished Henrik Lundqvist, who cares about this Carey Price guy? We'll beat him too. And then it's LA. And that was another LA team similar to their run in 2012 that I don't think they were losing. But I do think if they get to the conference final or even the Stanley Cup final, Dan Bylsma is probably staying on as coach. Ray Shero is probably staying on as general manager. Because if you win 2 rounds, at that point, what else can you ask for? Obviously the Stanley Cup, but that's your expectation with that core, with Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Marc-Andre Fleury, Chris Letang, is that your expectation is that you are going to go to, at the minimum, the conference final. And if you make it to the Final Four, you got as good a chance of anybody. But, I mean, that's a serious ripple effect, too, because if they don't hire Jim Rutherford, in fact, he probably doesn't even work in the sport anymore. He probably, because remember, just weeks before they hired him, he stepped away from Carolina with the intention to retire. There was no, we're parting of the ways and I'm done. He was out. He was done. And then Pittsburgh was one of the only places he said he'd go. And they came knocking, and man, did he ever go on a heater too.
You don't see the James Neal for Patrick Hornqvist trade. You don't even see the Phil Kessel trade. I don't think Ray Shero does that. There's no way.
No, as good of a general manager as Ray Shero was, he was not known for the big swing. He was known, he was, and listeners, I'm not comparing the two, very similar to Kyle Dubas in the sense that occasionally he will take the big swing and make the big move, but more often than not, he finds the inefficiency. He finds a team that's looking to shed a guy that might not be that sexy, that might not be that great. Think James Neal. He wasn't really doing all that well in Dallas, and then he comes to Pittsburgh and boom, he discovers himself. So that, so you probably don't see the Phil Kessel trade. So we don't get the Phil Kessel memes. We don't get the hot dog memes. We don't get Phil Kessel's a Stanley Cup champion on the Boulevard of the Allies. But again, as much as I want to jump into that multiverse and screw with that timeline like I'm Loki, I don't know if I like that alternate universe.
The funny thing about that loss to the Rangers was, I was still a teenager at the time, but I remember like when the final buzzer went off, I just felt relieved. I'm like, I would have been happy if they won, of course, because you go to the Eastern Conference Final, been the first time they just went to the Eastern Conference Final the year before, so I don't know what the heck I'm talking about, but they would have played a Canadiens team who I think they would have potentially beaten. I know Carey Price was at the height of his powers. Remember, I think Price would have played that whole series, considering what happened next round with the Rangers and the Canadiens with Chris Kreider. That probably does not happen in that series, so you have to factor that in. But just overall, I felt relieved because either way, with the result, I was going to be happy. Either the Penguins are going to go back to the Eastern Conference Final, or they were going to make changes that they really needed to make. Because I remember being in high school just like a week, or not even a week, a few days after, just reading the articles on the Trib and the Post-Gazette saying like, oh yeah, their ownership's talking about it. And I'm like, yeah, just drop it. Just drop that.
Rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, rip the Band-Aid off. And then when it eventually happened, I was like, yeah, I knew this was coming because there were so many failures for this team after 2009. You couldn't just keep running it back. So I was fine with it. I've obviously gotten over that loss now. It's been 9 years.
And it wasn't like tough luck failures, hockey failures where, hey, sometimes you get beat. There were so many moments between 2009 and 2014, which seems wild to say because it's all of a 5-year period, but there were so many losses and so many moments and so many avoidable mistakes that by the time you got to 2014, to quote Thanos, inevitable.
Right. I think that's a great way of putting it. But Yeah, I mean, you also said it best before. I don't think it's a rabbit hole that I fully want to go down, but considering everything that they accomplished after that. Honestly, in some way, this like prepared them for the success that they were going to have, at least the core in 2016, 2017, and even after, even though they haven't won a series in 2018, you know, those back-to-back cups still live forever. So it's still a big one. Much would have been different, but I don't think I'm not unhappy about it. That's for sure. But that will wrap up this second segment. Coming up in the final segment, the final what if Mario Lemieux stays healthy throughout his entire career? That's coming up right after this.
All right, Penguins fans, we're throwing it back for the final segment. And it's one that if you enjoy an adult beverage you've had sitting in a bar, it's one you've definitely had on hockey Twitter if you're on hockey Twitter. And it's one you've probably just mumbled to yourself walking around the house when you think about the Penguins. What if Mario Lemieux stays relatively healthy? Right out of the gate, if he stays healthy, he is the all-time leader in scoring. There is no discussion. Nobody is going to top Mario Lemieux, and it's going to make Gretzky's records look minuscule. Because let's just go back to 1993. Mario Lemieux leaves because tragically he finds out he has been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he has to go through radiation treatments, very aggressive radiation treatments. When he comes back, miraculously, on the same day of his final treatment in Philadelphia, he's 12 points behind Pat LaFontaine for the NHL scoring lead. And he just casually rattles off 56 points in 20 games to end the season, to take over the scoring lead and win it by, funny enough, 12 points.
I love that story because it goes to show how amazing Mario was at the height of his powers. And you know this too. Philadelphia, they gave him a standing ovation when he came back that night. And that is super rare, especially between these two rivals and the city of Philadelphia as a whole.
You know what else happened during that run? He came back and had either a 4 or 5 goal night at Madison Square Garden. And remember, this is 80s, 90s Penguins Rangers. This is almost on par with Penguins Flyers. Standing ovation after his 4th or 5th goal. Like, just, you know what? He's back. He's the greatest. We got nothing. Mario Lemieux, ladies and gentlemen. Mario Lemieux.
They witnessed greatness. Like, that's still something I wish I was born earlier, because I wish I got to see him in his prime.
Yeah, I mean, me too. Like, because the 1993 run, I'm all of 2 years old when that happens. So I'm alive, but I'm not processing what's happening. And by the time I was really old enough to kind of understand hockey at a better level than just like team in black and gold good, other team bad, he retired his first time. So like I didn't really ever get to experience Mario Lemieux, but I mean, I would watch like those highlight tapes and those retrospectives on him as a kid. And it was just incredible because when you come out of the 80s and into the 90s, like the early 90s is the very tail end of the high scoring 70s and 80s and into the dead puck era, you can start seeing it develop. But then there's just this guy, Mario Lemieux, head and shoulders above everybody else. He's still able to score at a pace that they did in the 70s and 80s. And you watch him play, and it's simply unfair because he had the vision and grace of someone like Wayne Gretzky. And he had the build of a 90s era dead puck era defenseman. So not only could he deke around you and dangle you out of your jockstrap, if that didn't work, he was just going through you. He didn't care. And then he'd get to the net and goalies were just like, well, he can pick every corner perfectly or he's going to deke me out of my pads. What do I do here? And I just like, you think about all the stuff he had to go through with his back, with cancer, and just, he missed an entire season in the mid 90s because his back was that bad. Like, right. And there were years where he would come into the locker room for a game and his back was so bad he couldn't tie his own skates, and then he'd go out and put up 4 points. It was absurd.
And they definitely at least have one extra Stanley Cup if he's able to stay a lot more healthy and doesn't get diagnosed with cancer. I don't think that's a weird hot take or anything to say that, or maybe even 2, to be honest.
I mean, 1995 or 1996 were 2 absolutely loaded Penguins teams.
That 96 team was unreal.
Like, and if they have a full go Mario Lemieux and a full go Jaromir Jagr, that team is just steamrolling the National Hockey League top to bottom. And I mean, again, like it sucks to play this game. Like, as spoiled as we are as Penguins fans, because since the 90s, nobody has won more. Nobody, not a single franchise. And yet we're sitting here going, man, if we'd had that guy, we'd have even more.
We sound very spoiled, don't we?
We really do. And I know that before we go, there is one thing you wanted to end the show on. I don't have anything else for Mario Lemieux other than I think he's better than Gretzky just overall. Like, Gretzky has the numbers and the accolades, but like, I do think if we're sitting on, if there was ever a height of their powers 1v1, Mario would win. But that's all I've got to add. What do you got anything else for Mario, or should we head to our last thing? It unfortunately is going to take a fun discussion and derail it a little bit, but we got to talk about it.
Yeah, just quick second on that but I do want to say, I believe Wayne Gretzky has said publicly that Mario would have shattered his records if he were healthy. So wanted to put that out there to end the discussion on Mario. But yeah, we're going to end the show just by giving our heartfelt condolences to Rick Jeanneret and his family. He passed away at the age of 81 on Thursday night. Longtime Buffalo Sabres play-by-play announcer, was there for over 50 years. Not only one of the greatest play-by-play announcers in the history of hockey, but one of the greatest play-by-play announcers in the history of sports. The calls that he made were so electrifying, they brought you out of your seat. The Mayday one in 1993 against the Boston Bruins, that one is amazing. There's another one from about 6 to 7 years ago when he was toward the end of his career, when he called a Jack Eichel goal in overtime when he scored with less than 5 seconds left. And you can look the video up on YouTube. It's him calling it, and he just comes back and he's just putting his arms out like this. You have those two. Him calling fights also was tremendous. They don't make them how they used to. And I absolutely loved him as a play-by-play announcer. Also, if you ever want to look up any of his calls on Pat LaFontaine, please do that too. He is a legend on those calls. He's a legend on any call. And it's really unfortunate that he passed away on Thursday night, but I'm just sending my heartfelt condolences to his family during this time. Pat, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, this is no disrespect to anybody that calls the game. God knows I couldn't do it. Just in an era where so many announcers are very similar, just because it's become such a streamlined job and process, like you said, they do not make them like Rick Jeanneret anymore. And because we're from Pittsburgh, because we are Penguins fans, like, we know all about it. And having a guy like Mike Lang, a guy who is on your airwaves, is shamelessly in the tank for your team, but that's all part of the fan experience. You don't want your hometown guy pretending to be this impartial, unbiased, looker of truth. You want him to go nuts when you score in overtime. You want him to put the big moments in perspective in the way that only you as a fan or your team could. So, I mean, just you bringing up the Mayday call, you bringing up the Eichel call, you bringing up Pat LaFontaine. He was so good. I could hear it in my own head and got chills without actually having to hear it. So, terrible loss for the hockey community, even worse loss for the city of Buffalo. And of course, all the love in the world to his family, because by all accounts, not one of just the best broadcasters, one of the best human beings there is.
Absolutely. And he will forever go down as one of the greatest to ever do it. I've said this for a long time. I think him and Mike Lang are the 2 best hockey announcers we've ever seen. And I will die on that hill.
Those 2 and Doc Emmerich.
Yes. I think that the top 3 right there, there's really no one better than those 3. But Rick, rest in peace. You did a tremendous job when you were calling Sabres games, and the hockey community and just the sports community as a whole, it's not going to be the same without you. But that will do it for this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. Thank you all so much for listening to / watching this one. Pat and I will be back with another episode on Monday. That'll be another full week, well, another 3-day-a-week episodes. And then Pat is going to be solo the following week for a couple of episodes as I go on my final summer vacation. I'm going to be heading down to the Barbados. So you'll have that to look forward to in about a couple of weeks. But again, thank you all so much for listening to / watching this one. We'll be back on Monday. I'm going to Guns N' Roses tonight. I got my shirt on for those watching on YouTube. Should be a lot of fun. But again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Talk with you all again in a few days.